Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to the Singapore GP post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this race? Did you think it was kind of boring because Lando went off with such a big lead on this race, or did you get sad because you were thinking this is Daniel's last race for this being in F1 potentially? Or when you excited that they had some upcomers coming in and putting pressure on the back of the pack to see if they could do anything? Like Hulkenberg, not really a newcomer, but Hulkenberg actually staying in the top 10 throughout this race, kind of being out of sequence. But Franco doing a fairly good job in this really tough race, just getting outside the points. What was your thoughts? Did you get excited? Did you find it boring? There wasn't a whole lot of action on track. There was some, but not a whole lot. And then the pit strategy was kind of intermixed in that how well that actually played off and what kind of strategy were involved. I know there was some outside long shots that didn't pay off, and there was some weirdness that kind of went through, with Carlos Sainz switching over fairly early and making it semi work to get him up farther up in the field than he started off with. But in general, I don't know, I thought it was a okay race. I still love watching those cars underneath the lights at night. I think that's really fabulous looking, but I think the race itself wasn't quite that good. I didn't see a whole lot of what I was thinking of, like as the strategy calls or the action on track that would potentially have that front runner, spot being, overtaken or put pressure on. We saw a little bit more of a defensive actions in regard. So I'd probably rank it maybe a 6, possibly a 7, but not anything that's really super exciting in my view. Now, just to give you a brief overview of how the race went. We had Lando take pole, of course, and started off and had a good start for once. And after 5 laps, he was 1.8 seconds ahead. And at 10 laps, he was 4.8 seconds ahead. And lap 20, he was 15.1 seconds ahead. And then we had some pits coming in and out, so he was only 2.9 seconds ahead of his teammate Oscar on lap 30. But back to lap 45, it kind of resorted the order, and he was 23.8 seconds ahead of Max. And by the end, it was only a 20.9 second lead over Max Verstappen. So he looks very steady, very controlled race for Lando Norris in this running. I know there's a lot of pressure on him for the start of the race because he's really struggling with that start, maintaining that lead. But overall, I think he did a really good job in this, and then he maintained that front, and he was trying to keep the fastest lap, which was then taken over near the very end of the race. So he couldn't really put that extra pressure on Max for the point-wise. And with Max being that second position pretty much the whole race, that also kind of caused some issues, I think, in Lando's mind, saying that he needed to keep going, put as much pressure as he could, driving to the edge, and that almost cost him a couple of times by running into the wall. So I know he almost collided directly into the wall by missing his braking point, and I know he kissed the wall, as they say, several times during this race as well. So any of those little mistakes could have cost him significantly in this race. So that kind of helped keep some of the tension up, in my view, but it wasn't quite as much as I would have liked. Anyway, I will go from the back of the pack to the front of the pack like I normally do, and we will talk about how the driver did and what happened to them if I know. So, without further ado, we will start off, if I can get there, with Alex Albon, who ended up DNFing, did not finish. He did do a decent job in this race, except he just said that the car was overheating and had to retire that car. So there was something kind of wrong on that air coolant sake in this race that ended up making him box about lap 17 to just retire that car. He didn't have a very good start, and I know he complained about his teammate kind of dive bombing down the inside on that first lap. But he did that without causing any incidents or anything, so it's hard to blame him for that. I know it's probably a risky move, but you also have to know that he is in that car for only a short period of time, and he needs to make all of the impressions that he can to say that he needs a ride in the future, permanent ride in the future for some team. So I think that was kind of putting that pressure, and I think he did a good job in that regard. Going back to Albon, he didn't get a chance to really show what he could do in this. He did start on a set of mediums and was switching to a set of hards on lap 11. And then I said he ended up having to retire that car on about lap 17. Kevin Magnussen was doing decent, not great, but doing a decent job overall, but then had to retire his car as well due to basically a puncture that basically ended up causing some other issues, I think, overall, and wasn't worth him continuing on. He did start off on a set of hard, so he's trying to go for that long haul at the very beginning, but only could make it to lap 28 before switching to a set of mediums. And then he went to lap 49 on a set of mediums before switching to a set of softs because of that puncture. And I think he was running at the back of the field at that point in time. So I think they were, with the other issues that they were potentially seeing in that Haas, it wasn't worth him just putting that pressure to be at the back of the field. So they ended up retiring him on about lap 60, I believe it was. I do have him passing Gasly on lap 39 for 15th, passing Ricardo, getting up to 14th, and then he had that puncture on, that at the lap 50-ish, had to come in for that box, and then just kind of melded out from there. So 49.50 for that puncture. So not a great race for him, not the best where he wanted to be, but he was doing a decent job, not where I think a lot of people were expecting him to be after having no points, being able to put pressure. But I know there were some people that were having to get behind him, and he was kind of backing up the field to some degree with those different tire strategies at the beginning. And the heartbreak for a lot of people is Daniel Ricciardo's, potentially, at least rumored to be his last race, is that this was the last one on his contract. And so we'll have to determine what happens at Coda, if he comes back and extends that contract, or if that seat goes to Liam Lawson for the rest of the season, and see what Liam can do to help them give a good detail of what they're going to do in the future. But he qualified in 16th and ended up in 18th. He started off on a set of softs, one of the few people to start on softs. Went to lap 10 before having to switch to mediums. Went to lap 46 before switching to a set of softs. Then only made it to a few laps to 58 before switching to another set of softs for the fastest lap run. So he did take that away from Lando Norris, which helped out his sister team and Max Verstappen keep that point away from Lando in that tight grid at the front. So I think that was more of a favor at the end than him just potentially just showing him what he can do, even in an RB in these tight conditions, still get fastest lap of the race. Try to help sell his abilities, if nothing else, since he wasn't doing that great overall in the race. He did pass Juan Yujo on lap 32 for 14th, passed Gasly on lap 37 for 12th. He did end up having to swap positions with Yuki, who was on a different tire strategy that pushed him back a little bit farther in that pack as well. So kind of a sad run for Daniel Ricciardo. It's not quite up to where his expectation is for this race, and his fans still love him, but I know that they're wanting him to be a little bit more higher performance than he's been showing lately. I think they were expecting him to at least beat Yuki Tsunoda on all of the GP races that he has been in, and that hasn't been the case. So we'll have to see if this is really his last race in F1, or if he figures out a way to finagle a seat with the Red Bull or the RB, or potentially another team in the future. I know there's some speculation that he might go to IndyCar as well. But he did get driver of the day, I think mainly because it was basically said as his last race in F1, and so that was the constitution for all the fans saying, hey, we still love you, we'll give you the driver of the day, even though his race performance didn't really warrant him having the driver of the day, in my opinion, for this Singapore GP race. Pierre Gasly also had another issue, having trouble in this race, driving in this. He did qualify in 18th and make it up to 17th, so that is a improvement, but it's not quite where he wanted to be. I think he's trying to push up farther up and trying to do that different strategy. He gained a position at the very start of the race, so that was good to see. He went to lap 37 on a set of mediums before switching to a set of softs, and I think that killed him at the end. Basically, that soft didn't last as long as he wanted it to, and so he couldn't quite keep up with the rest of the field. And so he kind of fell back into the clutches around him. So that's not quite where Pierre Gasly wants to be, or kind of wants to show off in that Alpine, even though he has that Alpine seat for next season. And then you have Valtteri Bottas, qualified in 19th and ended up in 16th. It wasn't a very good day for him either. He will start off on a set of hard, so he was trying to go long like Daniel. He did make it to lap 33 before switching to a set of mediums, but then that medium set, or where he came in, wasn't very good in that regard. And I think the slightly newer tire that Juan Zhou had ended up proving better overall, maybe for that performance or in that Stake F1 car or whatever, but he ended up only to 16th, where his teammate got ahead of him, and so that's not the greatest look. When he's looking for that Audi seat, trying to prove that he should be in that Audi seat, besides some other folks that are now looking to potentially be in that running, like Franco Colapinto, who doesn't have a seat next year, potentially grabbing the eye of Audi and bringing a young person into that arena. So we'll have to see how that all plays out, see if that will hurt him in the long run. But it didn't look, he did improve, but he didn't improve as well as his teammate did. And so that's not as always the good sign that you're battling your teammate in that same hardware. Speaking of his teammate, he qualified in 20th and ended up in 15th. He did pass Bottas on lap 6 for that 19th position. He was also on a set of hards and went to lap 34, so a lap longer than Valtteri, and then switching to a set of mediums that made him go the rest of the field the way on that medium tire, getting up to 15th. Still ahead of Pierre Gasly for both of them, so that's always a good sign that they're actually beating at least someone, even though it's that Stake F1 car is pretty pathetic looking lately. Hasn't really shown what it can do in no improvements like it had in the very beginning of this season. So they're really struggling at the very back of the field. So it's a good view, in my opinion, for Juan Zhou actually making it past his teammate and into that 15th position. Lance Stroll had another bad day. Lost a position at the start of the race. He did start in 17th and make it up to 14th. So it's some improvement there, but not where he wants to be, especially with his teammate making points. He did pass Daniel Ricciardo on lap 47 for 15th, and then he passed K-Mag on lap 50 for 14th. He did start on a set of hards and went to lap 26 before switching to a set of mediums. So that was all good and good, but it's a standard Stroll race in my view. He's not quite where he needs to be, not quite at that top level. Still needs a lot of improvement. He's been in F1 quite a long time. I think they really need to look at that position, even though I know they're not. I think it's going to hurt them, but we'll have to see when they get the specs working on that aerodynamic for the car in the future to see if that really helps him improve, or if that he just still stagnates in those second Aston Martin car. Esteban Ocon started the race in 15th and made its way up to 13th. He did start on a set of mediums and went to lap 29 before switching to a set of hards. He did gain 2 positions, so a good start for him on that first lap for Esteban Ocon. And he passed Gasly on lap 38 for 14th and passed Daniel Ricciardo for 13th later on in the race. So he didn't get a whole lot of action, but he did a decent job, not quite into the points, not quite putting pressure as much as he really wanted to on Yuki. I know he was getting closer to that, but in that trio there between Yuki and Franco and that Alpine. So he's putting pressure there, but not quite as much as he would like to get by those folks in the front of him to get to that point range. Then you have Yuki Tsunoda. I'm sure wasn't happy with this, but he did qualify in 8th and then dropped down to 12th. I don't think he liked his strategy too much. I know he was kind of fighting, and he was with his teammate for a little while before they were trying to make him get closer to his teammate before swapping positions. And I know he was on a set of soft, so he's just worried about damaging those soft tires at that point in time. He did lose 3 positions on the first lap, so that was not a very successful start for him. But he did pass Gasly on lap 38 for 13th. And then he swapped positions with Daniel Ricciardo on lap 42 for that 12th position, where he ended up overall. Where he couldn't quite get by Franco Clemento on track, so he ended up behind him at the very end. Speaking of Franco, he was qualified in 12th and made it up to 11th. I know he was struggling in that Williams and was not happy with his drive himself. I think he was saying he wasn't very much conserved energy in that Williams at this really hot Singapore race. I know he was really struggling with that, so he didn't get the communications overall, and I think they were talking about the tire windows that they didn't quite get right on that Williams, but he did a fairly good job, I think, of getting just outside of points in this run. He did a really good job. I said that really dive bomb down the front on that first lap, gaining 4 positions in that run, and so he didn't get any issues, didn't cause any penalty points or any other penalties as well for that maneuver. So I think it was really good. I mean, I don't think he collided with anybody or touched anybody. So overall, I can't complain about that. He took advantage of that on this track that's hard to pass, got himself up front in this running, and then basically was able to maintain that position over the rest of the race. So a good job for him, even though it wasn't quite what he was looking for. And Williams kind of messed up what it sounded like on some of their tire strategy to keep them in that window, to give them that little bit of improvement. Well, that hits the bottom 10. So we hit the top 10. So we have Sergio Perez, who qualified in 13th and made it up to 10th. I know that's not quite where they were looking for. I think they were looking for possibly even right at that edge of that podium for that Red Bull, but they didn't quite make it. And then he was stuck behind Nico Hülkenberg for a long time in that running as well. So I think that was hurt him quite a bit. He wasn't able to really take advantage and pass him to get into those runnings with him. He did gain 3 positions at the very start of the race. He did start in a set of mediums and went to lap 28 before switching to a set of hards, but it's still not the look that Perez needs. So we'll have to see if that helps or hurts him in this run for that Red Bull seat that he supposedly signed for, but has some of those clauses that potentially could get him removed after crashing out, which was potentially not his fault last week, and then basically just barely getting into the points this week. It doesn't look like he is getting the points that Red Bull needs to really put pressure back on McLaren for that constructor standings, even though there's still a chance there that they can pull back ahead of them and maintain that first position for this year as well. So I think there's more pressure on Sergio Perez as this race and the races to come if he stays in that seat. And he really needs to thrive under that pressure instead of falling back into the clutches of the people around him. And getting stuck behind Nico Hülkenberg is not the best look, since that Haas is technically would be considered not to be in that front runner pack, even though Nico Hülkenberg did an excellent job of getting there on qualifying and then being able to pretty much maintain that top 10 position. So speaking of, he did qualify in 6th, which was amazing for Hülkenberg, and then kept it into that 9th, even though it was a decrease from where he qualified from. It was a really good run for him. He did everything he could, I think, in this run to maintain points, and getting 2 points puts a lot of pressure now as Haas is advancing ahead in that constructor standing. So we'll see if that plays out in the future as that comes across. But he did a really good job. I think he did start a set of mediums and went to a set of hards on lap 29. he did have Oscar on that lap, and then kind of switched back and forth with Oscar, then kind of ran that through. So he did a decent start, even though he didn't keep that position at the start of the race. He did overtake Oscar, where Oscar was able to re-overtake him before that lap end, so he didn't get credit for that. But that was really good in my view, of even overtaking one of the McLarens in that race to really keep him in that front runner positions that kind of push back some of those other people in that front train in that run. So I think a really good job for Nico Hulkenberg. And probably deserves the driver of the day, in my opinion, having that Haas overall this weekend, getting that way up in there and gaining points, probably when he probably shouldn't have been able to do that. Fernando Alonso qualified in 7th and ended up in 8th. I have him basically going to lap 25 on a set of mediums before switching to a set of hards, which is the normal strategy. He did pass K-Mag on lap 29 for 13th in that run. So he had to go repass several people during this race because of that pit strategy, getting behind and then letting them either pit or have to overtake them on track. So a good job for Fernando, even though he dropped back a position. Still good points for Aston Martin to keep them in that 5th running constructor standing for them. Pretty much dedicated in there where they can't quite catch up, I don't think, to the front runners, but still ahead enough of the back runners to worry about getting dropped back farther in that constructor standing. So a good job for him in this race. I don't know, it's like one of the harder races he said that he's ever run in the past. So being in the Singapore in the heat, he was trying to conserve his energy and saying he was only coming out when he had to during this weekend, right at the last minute before jumping into that Aston Martin and going around the track. So good job for him, being an older driver in this running and still being able to keep up with the younger folks in this heat. Carlos Sainz, I said, was on the weird, slightly odd strategy. He did qualify in 10th after having his car spin in that qualifying run and end his qualifying early on that last qualifying session, dropping him to that last 10th position, but he made his way up to 7th through the slightly alternate pit strategy. He did lose 2 positions at the start of the race, so that hurt him, so he had to kind of like work his way back up through. He started off with a set of mediums and only went to lap 13. So one of the front runners to switch from tires to pit strategy, and then he went the rest of the way on that set of hards. He did pass Juan Yuzhou on lap 20 for 16th. He passed Stroll on lap 22 for 15th, and he passed Ocon on lap 30 for 10th. So he kind of got back up into that point position, so he got a point. Then due to some of the other pit strategies, moved his way back up to 7th. So a good job for Carlos, even though it wasn't the strategy that I think he was wanting to drive. It was a strategy that he needed to go to help try to push him forward in this run. Lewis Hamilton qualified in 3rd and ended up in 6th. I think he didn't like the strategy that put him on at all. He started off on a set of softs, which then pitted on lap 17. So a few laps farther on those softs than Carlos did on his mediums before switching to a set of hards. And then I think he was hoping to go even a longer distance on that softs because it made a long distance on that hard tire. So he kind of fell back into the clutches in that run and almost got passed by Carlos as well. He did pass K-Mag on lap 20 for 12th. He passed Ocon on lap 23 for 11th. And passed Tsunoda on lap 28 for 9th. So he was kind of back in that grid fairly early on, having to fight his way back through on that and keep that hard tire alive for the rest of the race, which he wasn't really happy about, but it did get him up to 6th overall. So we'll have to see if that kind of plays out or not. It didn't quite make it up to Charles Leclerc, and he was still behind his teammate. So that kind of plays into how well he liked that strategy as well, I believe. But still a decent run, probably not the run he wanted, and potentially not the run that he deserved in this race, but he did the best he could with that strategy that he was given. So I'm not positive if that was the best strategy for Lewis, but it did give them the option potentially to take the lead in this race with those soft tires being up there so far, but it didn't pay out at the end. So I think that was the big thing, was that they were trying to push for the win, even though they didn't have really a chance for the win in the Singapore run. So probably not the best strategy for him, but he did the best he could in that strategy. Charles Leclerc qualified in 9th and ended up in 5th. I think he did a decent job. I know they were talking to him quite a bit over the radio throughout this race. He did gain a position at the start of the race. He went to 36 on that set of medium tires before switching to a set of hard. So he went fairly long on that set of mediums. He did pass Alonso on lap 26 for 6th. He passed Hulkenberg on lap 29 for 4th. He passed Alonso on lap 41 for 7th. Swapped position with Sainz on lap 43 for 6th. And then passed Hamilton on lap 51 for that 5th position. So he did a really good job in that run, going long, really pushing pressure, and then get that fresh set of tires where he could re-overtake Lewis and get past into that 5th position and get some decent points for Ferrari. I think their strategy was fairly good for Ferrari for once, having them qualified a little bit farther back in that pack and trying to get up in that front runners, to potentially get to the podium positions, which they weren't able to do, but it was a good run, I think a good choice for them. George Russell qualified in 4th and ended up in 4th. He had a pretty interesting run. I know he was looking for some advice and some, uplifting statements. He was going around this track trying to say, look, how am I doing, in this race? Because he was trying to keep himself mentally in this race, being in that 4th position. He did go to lap 27 on a set of mediums before switching to a set of hards, and was able to still maintain that 4th position overall. So a decent run for George in this run. Not a lot of action on track, but still mind games kind of running through this hot race, which kind of helps you in that regard, because it can, the heat and the strain basically going around this track it could potentially cost him some positions where he was not quite focused as well as he could. So I think it was a good run for George, even though it may not be the best what he was hoping for, trying to gain positions and be ahead of Oscar in this run, but a decent run, I think, for George Russell. Oscar Piastri didn't have the qualifying he was wanting and qualified in 5th, but he made his way up to 3rd. He did have a decent race. He did do some overtaking on track, so that was good to see. He went to lap 38 on a set of mediums and then switched to a set of hards, and then he basically took 5th place from Hulkenberg on lap 1, and then basically kind of kept that overall. He passed George on lap 40 for 4th, and then passed George again on lap 45 for 3rd. So during that run, he was able to kind of maintain some of those weird spots, get back up in the running, and maintain all of that overall into that last podium position. So good damage control for him for being not quite where he wanted to be on the qualifying session, but maintained all the points he could. And then we have Max Verstappen in 2nd, who ended up in 2nd. He had pretty much a lonely race in this, I think, kind of ahead of Oscar and George for a good, amount of time. Not really being threatened from them, but not really threatening Lando as well. So kind of being a lone race. In that, he went to lap 29 on a set of mediums before switching to a set of hards. He did pass Leclerc on lap 30 for that 2nd position again after the pit strategies were involved, where he had to pit and then re-overtake on track before Leclerc pitted himself. So in all of that, it was good. Good damage control for Max. not losing the points that he was potentially thought he was going to lose at the beginning of the weekend. Really struggling with that Red Bull. I know he's, saying it was sliding all over the place, even during the race, but was able to maintain the tires and keep him well ahead of Oscar, but yet not being able to really compete against Lando. And then Lando had a great start, kept ahead of him, broke that, that curse that people said that he had about getting pole position and then losing that first position on the very first lap, potentially the first corner of that lap. But he was able to get out ahead and then slowly pull out that lead. Actually, not really slowly. Did a pretty dominant job on pulling out a lead and maintaining that lead. He did have some issues, as I said. He almost missed his braking point and almost ran straight into the barriers, but was able to turn and only kind of scratched that front wing. And there were some questions of whether that was, because that was early in the race, whether that was actually going to cause him issues, as they did not replace that on when he pitted, and whether they should have replaced that wing or not is also the question, if he was losing that time. But it didn't look like it from my point of view. I know there wasn't a lot of data at that point when he pitted, so there were some questions whether he should have stayed out another lap or two to gain that data to really solidify what they should have done. But they chose correctly, I think, in that regard, that he still had a dominant win overall. He started on a set of mediums, went to lap 30 on that set of mediums before switching to a set of hards, and just kind of ran away with it. As I said, by lap 5, he had a 1.8 second lead over Max Verstappen, so he had broken that DRS early on, and then just kind of worked his way, because lap 10 he had a 4.8, and by lap 20 of 15.7, and then I think he got up to like a 26 second lead. I'm not positive on that. I didn't quite keep track of all that, but I know at lap 45 he had a 23.8 second lead before it dropped back down to a 20 second lead at the end. So he was pretty much a dominant lead on this race throughout the whole race. It was only him that was going to take himself out by running into the wall or crashing in that regard of hitting the wall that would have potentially taken him out. I know he was hoping to get that fastest lap to keep edging out more points on Max Verstappen for that Drivers' Championship, but with Daniel coming at the very end to take that point away from Lando, that kind of shrinks that point overall benefit for Lando over Max in this race. So, but it's still edging out, creeping up towards Max's point running. So that's always good to see as we come out with the last several races to see how that Red Bull can respond. I know in the past they weren't looking that good, but potentially I think there was those races that they already knew that Red Bull wasn't going to look very good at. And so we coming into the end of these that I know they're fairly strong in, we'll have to see how that plays out and see if Max can keep that lead throughout the rest of the season, or if that shrinks and is able to, we'll have to give that lead up to Lando due to some other issues with that Red Bull or some driver errors that Max makes in the last 7 races. So that kind of gives you the overall picture of how all the drivers did and what happened to them, and what does this do to the driver standings? Well, not a whole lot. I mean, that lead that Max has shrinks a little bit, but he's still decently in the lead with 331 points over Lando's 279. Now, with Nico Hülkenberg gaining 2 points, he basically passes Lance Stroll back for that 10th position. So that's good to see. So he gets back into that top 10 for the driver standing. So we'll have to see if that plays out in his favor by the end of the season or not, or if Lance can come back on him later. And for the constructor standing, so we still have McLaren in the lead after they took the lead last weekend. And we have them now at 516 points over Red Bull's 475 points. So still not a significant lead, and Ferrari still in the hunt with 441 points. And then you have basically Aston Martin in that fifth position, pretty much stable, pretty much guaranteed not to fall back into that sixth position, but probably and nowhere near getting up to that fourth position. So they're pretty much have locked in that fifth position for Aston Martin. Now we have the Haas gaining a couple points, so they have now 31. So they're just behind RB now with 34. So that could switch easily within the next several races. So we'll have to see how RB responds to that point scoring that Hulkenberg has done at this race to see if they can get either the new driver for RB or Yuki to get back up into that point standing again. And that may play into the decisions that they do over this next several weeks before the COTA race. So what is coming up? Of course, I just said COTA. So we have the United States of race, the Circuit of the Americas, or COTA. And this is a sprint race weekend. So the actual GP race will be on October 20th, and that sprint race will be on the 19th. And it was first introduced in 2012, and it has a length of 3.426 miles, and it'll have 56 laps run for a total race distance of 191.634 miles. And the current lap record holder is Charles Leclerc in 2019 with 1 minute 36.169 seconds. So you have a little bit of a break before COTA, and I will be at COTA, and hopefully we'll give you some decent action in this race. I know there's lots of championship availability. I know Red Bull is fairly decent at this racetrack, so we'll have to see how the McLarens can pull out on this track, if at all. They've looked fairly good this series of races, so I expect them to be in contention at least this next race GP in October 20th. And until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.